Mr. Speaker, the detail of the changes we propose may at first glance obscure the meaning of them. But the meaning is simple and we believe irresistible. As simple and irresistible as the idea of a Commonwealth of Australia was to the Australians of a century ago. The meaning then was a nation united in common cause for the common good. A nation which gave expression to the lives we lead together on this continent, the experience and hopes we share as Australians. The meaning now is still a product of that founding sentiment. It is that we are all Australians, we share a continent, we share a past, a present and a future. And our head of state should be one of us. Mr. Speaker,
the Prime Minister this week mapping out a path to an Australian Republic. Hello, welcome to Order in the House. I'm Maxine McKew. Well, with an election due within a year, and likely much sooner, it's hard to imagine any idea from the government that would win the opposition's support. An Australian Republic with an Australian head of state? No chance. Apart from anything else, the opposition argued we can't trust this parliament to choose a head of state. Instead, it wants a new parliament appointed to choose a referendum.
The coalition unhesitatingly recommits itself tonight, if elected at the next election, to establish in 1997 a People's Convention to examine not only the question of whether or not Australia should become a republic, but also the question, all these other questions that so many other sections of the Australian people wish to examine.
The week the Republic debate began in earnest. More on that shortly. While the way we would choose a Republican head of state dominated proceedings in Parliament this week, nobody forgot for long a much more pressing matter, choosing our next Prime Minister, and it was business as usual.
Mr. Speaker, what you saw from the Leader of the Opposition today was him fly off the handle. You saw his nerves rattle. Mr. Speaker, I'll have him rattling like a millionaire's baby before his time's up as opposition leader.
In retaliation, the opposition went rattling through the Prime Minister's personal history, checking his job references.
Probably the first person that got the Prime Minister right was John McInnes, who sacked him from the menswear department at David Jones, the 15th of July 1986. He was an arrogant person and often rude to customers, McGuinness said. We had complaints about him all the time. He was also unmanageable, elusive. I could never find him when I needed him. You know...
The Senate was up to its tricks again this week. For the first 2 days, not a piece of legislation debated. Not a word on the 55 packages of bills in front of it.
It has been an absolutely deliberate tactic.
Also this week, allegations under privilege by Liberal backbencher Ken Aldred that had even his colleagues ducking for cover.
Not only are known pedophiles tolerated by the senior management of DFAT, but they are actively promoted.
Both sides of Parliament condemned Mr Aldred for his remarks, none more harshly than Foreign Minister Gareth Evans.
In my 17 years in this Parliament, I've never seen worse abuses of parliamentary privilege than those perpetrated by the member for Deakin yesterday.
The Republican debate in Australia is not new. It's festered along quietly for generations. But it never gained momentum because there was never a question of decision. This week, Prime Minister Keating made it a question of decision. His speech on Wednesday night was broadcast nationally.
Mr. Speaker, governments can wait for opinion to force their hand, or they can lead. They can wait for the world to change and respond as necessity demands, or they can see the way the world is going and point the way. Creation of an Australian Republic is not an act of rejection. It is one of recognition. The fact is that if the plans of our nationhood were being drawn up now by this generation of Australians and not those of a century ago, it is beyond question that we would make our head of state an Australian. We're proposing nothing more than the obvious. Our head of state should embody and represent Australia's values and traditions, Australia's experience and aspirations. We need not apologise for the nationalism in these sentiments. In truth, they contain as much common sense as patriotism. This is a point I think worth making. This Republican initiative is not an exercise in jingoism. It is not accompanied by the beat of drums or chess. It asserts nothing more than our unique identity. An Australian head of state can embody our modern aspirations, our cultural diversity, our evolving partnerships with Asia and the Pacific, our quest for reconciliation with Aboriginal Australians, our ambition to create a society in which women have equal opportunity, equal representation and equal rights. It changes nothing more than what is required to make clear and unambiguous our independence and responsibility for our own affairs. It's a small step, but a highly significant one. The government believes that at this stage of our history, it is a logical and an essential one. In declaring ourselves for an Australian Republic, we can give expression to both our best traditions and our current sensibilities and ambitions. At present, under the Constitution, Australia's head of state is the Queen, and her heirs and successors in the sovereignty of the United Kingdom. The Queen's role as head of state is in most respects carried out by the Governor-General. Of the responsibilities the Queen retains, the most notable is her appointment of the Governor-General, which by convention she does on the advice of the Prime Minister. We are not quite alone among the countries of the world in having as our head of state someone who is not one of our own citizens, but we are in a very small minority, and a majority of the countries in the Commonwealth of Nations are republics with their own head of state. Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding that the Queen is Australia's head of state and fulfils that duty conscientiously, when she travels overseas, she represents only the United Kingdom. This is, of course, right and proper for the head of state of the United Kingdom. The right head of state for Australia is one of us. It is a role only an Australian can fill. Each and every Australian should be able to aspire to be our head of state. Every Australian should know that the office will always be filled by a citizen of high standing who has made an outstanding contribution to Australia and who, in making it, has enlarged our view of what it is to be Australian. In these and other ways, the creation of an Australian Republic can actually deliver a heightened sense of unity. It can enliven our national spirit.
Order. And
in our own minds and those of our neighbours, answer beyond doubt the perennial question of Australian identity, the question of who we are and what we stand for. Measured against other stages of our development, it is a relatively simple and modest undertaking. 100 years ago, despite their rivalries and the enormous distances which separated them, the Australian colonies came together and created a nation. In the course of a century, we evolved from a collection of British colonies to a single nation of limited independence, to a dominion in the British Empire, to a sovereign nation in all respects bar one. For example, in the 1930s, the Governor-General ceased to be the representative of the British government in Australia and became the representative of the British monarch alone. In the same decade, it was accepted that the British monarch would act solely on the advice of the Australian government, not the British government, in relation to Australian matters. And Australia assumed responsibility for its own external affairs, which had been previously the responsibility of the British government. In 1930, for the first time, an Australian became Governor-General. With the abolition of all remaining rights of appeals to the Privy Council in London in the 1980s, Australian courts became the ultimate arbiters of Australian law. With the passage of the Australia Act, the Parliament of the United Kingdom relinquished the last vestiges of its power to make laws applying to Australia. In every instance, Mr. Speaker, there was controversy. Today, it's hard to imagine why the changes were opposed, and we're all the better for the changes. We have always recognised necessity and where our interests lie. If at times we've been cautious about taking large steps forward, it cannot be said that we've taken any backwards. That is what we seek with a republic, a small but important step forward, the last step in a process which began 100 years ago. We think it is time to embrace the necessary change. We therefore intend to ask the Australian people if they want an Australian Republic with an Australian head of state. Mr. Speaker, the change we propose has very limited implications for the design of Australia's democracy. Mr. Speaker, Commonwealth is a word of ancient lineage which reflects both our popular tradition and our federal system, and we propose that the Australian Republic retain the name Commonwealth of Australia. Under the proposals, the role of the House of Representatives and the Senate will remain unchanged, as will the role and powers of the states. Our membership of the Commonwealth of Nations, headed by the Queen, will not be affected. None of these things will change, but we will have an Australian as our head of state, and we propose that he or she be described by the term President of the Commonwealth of Australia. Mr. Speaker, the President will perform essentially the same functions as the Governor-General. Mr. Speaker, a former Australian Governor-General, Sir Zelman Cohen, described the Governor-General's role as the highest single expression in the Australian governmental structure of the idea that all Australians from all parties and all walks of life belong to the same nation. An Australian head of state would perform precisely this unifying role, and it follows would need to be of the same stature and integrity as we seek in our Governors-General. A significant element of the head of state's role is symbolic, performing ceremonial duties around the nation and abroad. The head of state will also continue to perform the formal administrative duties given to the Governor-General by legislation, which are undertaken on the advice of the Federal Executive Council. The head of state's duties here include formalising governmental regulations and appointing public officials. The head of state will assume the Governor-General's constitutional duties, most of which are by convention performed in accordance with the advice of the government of the day. These include summoning and dissolving the House of Representatives and the Parliament as a whole, and issuing writs for federal elections. The head of state will also take over the Governor-General's role as titular Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. In line with actual practice, we propose that the Constitution be amended to make clear that the head of state will exercise these constitutional duties on the advice of the government of the day. Finally, the head of state will retain those very few powers now held by the Governor-General, which in the most exceptional circumstances may be exercised without or possibly contrary to ministerial advice. These are the so-called reserved powers. The Republic Advisory Committee identified these powers as the power to appoint the Prime Minister, the power to dismiss the Prime Minister and therefore the government, and the power to refuse a request by the Prime Minister to dissolve one or both Houses of Parliament. I've no doubt that a great many people would like to see the head of state's discretionary or reserved powers tightly defined, as they are, for example, in the Irish Constitution. However, after careful consideration, the government has formed the view that it is probably impossible to write down or codify these powers in a way that would both find general community acceptance and cover every possible contingency. As the system evolves, there needs to be some capacity to respond to circumstances quite unforeseen today. Tightly defined rules can themselves have unforeseen consequences. For these reasons, the government believes that, on balance, whatever the immediate attraction of this course might be, it would not be desirable to attempt to codify the reserved powers, and that the design, processes and conventions at present governing their exercise by the Governor-General should be transferred to the Australian head of state without alteration. Mr. Speaker, we are aware that with this option there is a risk that Australian governments may occasionally find themselves in conflict with a head of state who exercises political judgment without regard to the conventions. We're also, of course, conscious of the possibility of a repetition of the events of 1975, when a government possessing the confidence of the House of Representatives was denied supply by the Senate. But the question of the Senate's powers over supply is a very different issue from that of establishing an Australian head of state. It's an issue that deserves to be addressed, but it doesn't need to be addressed at the same time. Mr. Speaker, if these reserve powers are to be given to a new head of state, it's critically important that the authority and source of the head of state's power is consistent with the national interest and the continued effective operation of our political system. There has been considerable debate in the community about how the head of state should be chosen. As things now stand, the Governor-General is appointed by the Queen, acting on the sole advice of the Prime Minister. It is clear that most believe the Prime Minister should not have such exclusive power in appointing an Australian head of state. The debate is principally between those who support popular election and those who favour election by the Parliament. The government has come to the view that if a new Australian head of state were to be elected by popular mandate, he or she would inherit a basis of power that would prove to be fundamentally at odds with our Westminster-style system of government. We cannot have a head of state who is above politics if we subject candidates to popular elections. We will instead get politicians, political parties and political campaigns. And we will get a head of state with an authority unheard of in our political system and discordant with some of the basic principles on which that system rests. We therefore propose as the Republic Advisory Committee suggested, that the head of state be elected by 2/3 majority vote in a joint sitting of both houses of the Commonwealth Parliament on the nomination of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet.
If that speech laid down for the first time the basis of the debate to come, question time in Parliament the next day marked the beginning of that debate.
I ask the Prime Minister specifically, is it your intention to include in your Republican Constitution a clause specifically providing that the reserved powers exercised by the head of state shall not be justiciable before the High Court?
Honourable the Prime Minister.
Very definitely, Mr Speaker, very definitely. Because,
Thank you very much.
Mr Speaker, I don't believe that the High Court should be adjudicating on matters of political dispute. I've made that point over and over again. Well, OK, as soon as you think I've given you an answer you're grateful for, you give me one. You give me one. I've got a simple one for you.
Order.
That is, and you can tell us tonight.
Order.
Whether you think an Australian should be our head of state. Simple enough. You know, Mr Speaker, it's not a complex or outrageous question. Simple enough, isn't it? Whether he thinks an Australian should be our head of state. Just worth recording again that one of his fellows in the Premier of Victoria had a few things to say about these things. He said, I think last night's speech, while it won't be agreed by all...
Member for Melbourne and the member for Wells.
...won't be agreed to by all, sets a blueprint for a discussion. There is a growing recognition that this issue is going to be resolved. And he goes on to say, a convention to me is just another committee. There's not much point calling out 400 people out of a community of 18 million, sitting them down and saying, now what do you think?
Speaker, my question without notice is to the Prime Minister. Will you confirm that any of the estimated 3 million Australians who hold dual citizenship will be able to be elected to the office of President of Australia?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the qualification I made clear last night. If you're an Australian citizen, you're qualified.
Does the Prime Minister accept that his statement last night was nothing less than a complete and absolute vindication of Sir John Kerr, who used the reserve powers, which you have deliberately left intact, to sack the most monumentally incompetent government in Australia's history, the Labor government of Gough Whitlam?
I wish you remember.
Order.
You were too, Minister. Mr Speaker,
right.
I ask the Prime Minister, are those who maintain the rage wrong? I ask, will the Labor Party, for a US Prime Minister, apologise to the family of Sir John Kerr for making him
the Prime Minister, I think, is trying to hear the question.
Up until the time of his death?
Those of us who were around in 1975 know that if the dispute had gone on a couple more days, the likelihood is Malcolm Fraser wouldn't even have been Leader of the Opposition. That is that there would have been a complete cave-in in the Senate, and of course the supply bill would have passed and the whole matter would have passed, and the then opposition may well have won the subsequent election 18 months later, but of course Malcolm Fraser lost that legitimacy he was always looking for, and it was permanently denied him as a consequence. It was also, Mr Speaker, it was also denied... That same legitimacy was also denied to Sir John Kerr. And Mr Speaker, let me say, I think that's been a very salutary exercise in what I described last night as one of the checks on a head of state. That is, someone who determines upon a course of action he or she knows to be controversial. They need to understand that the action is both warranted and capable of being defended. And if it's not warranted and capable of being defended, then they will have to wear the opprobrium of public opinion. What made it illegitimate was the fact that the power was abused. And it was abused by a Governor-General who refused to tell his Prime Minister what he had in mind. And as you know, I was with Gough Whitlam on the last occasion he saw Sir John Kerr, the very last occasion, that afternoon, and let me assure you, there was no attempt by him whatsoever to tell the then Prime Minister what he had in mind. And so He swore in Malcolm Fraser. Malcolm Fraser then had to wear a loss of confidence, a lack of confidence motion, a no confidence motion in the House of Representatives, and then, Mr. Speaker, the Governor-General refused to see the Speaker of the House of Representatives. When the head of state got down to refusing to see the Speaker of the House of Representatives, when he got down to refusing to see the Speaker of the House of Representatives, you knew basically, in moral terms, the game was up for him and has been up for him ever since.
In the Senate, Government Leader Gareth Evans made a telling point about the appointment of the President by Parliament.
In a Keating republic, would a two-thirds majority of both houses require bipartisan support to ensure that the head of state has the blessing of all major parties, as in 1975, when the coalition was within one seat of a two-thirds majority? And if so, would the head of state elected, as Mr Keating suggests, be nothing more than a political appointment from one side of politics?
The Leader of the the Leader of the Government of the Senate, Senator Evans.
Mr President, it remains the case that on no single occasion since the war has any single party commanded a coalition. Well, the voting system was different. Even you might be able to remember that, Senator Alston. In the post-war years, yeah, well, let's assume, even what might be thought of as a worst-case scenario, let's assume that at the next election, Labor gets the landslide it deserves, and we do, in fact, finish with a sufficiently large majority in the lower house and a sufficient change of the composition here to get a two-thirds majority. What's the worst? What's the worst that could possibly follow from that? The worst that could follow from that is that you're exactly where you are at the moment, where the Governor-General is in effect proposed by the government of the day, without any parliamentary contribution. That's the worst that could possibly happen. In a situation where there is no change to the powers of the President, as compared with those of the President Governor-General, no great disaster could be expected to follow from that.
Now, Mr Aldred is known as a decent man, but a man with an obsession about spies and conspiracies. Over the years, he has made numerous florid allegations under the protection of parliamentary privilege. This week, Ken Aldred outdid himself. First, in the main committee of the House of Representatives, he produced a letter allegedly from the ambassador of Suriname in Holland, mentioning the present head of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Mr Michael Costello, one of Mr Aldred's favourite targets, and about whom he has never produced anything of substance outside the protection of Parliament.
Excellency, we convey a security case containing $640,000 United States dollars, repeated in figures, as agreed with Agent Mark Latham. The above-mentioned funds should be distributed according to the schedules held by Your Excellency. Please sign the second letterhead copy and hand this personally to one of the two authorised Mossad agents. Received above funds, determined Special Officer.
Mr Aldred then spent 15 minutes in a rambling speech about the drug trade in Suriname and about Mr Costello's foreign affairs career. His mention, though, of Mossad earned this response from the Prime Minister in question time a short time later.
I suppose Mossad put the boy there, eh? Mossad, like Mossad took Malcolm Fraser's trousers, eh? Was it a Mossad plot? Eh? Maybe it was a Mossad plot. Mr Speaker, because the leader of the National Party said that Mossad took Malcolm Fraser's trousers. I mean, he did. And Mr Speaker, it comes along with other remarks about the Jewish state and its intelligence organisation as well.
But that didn't deter Mr Aldred. In the adjournment debate that night, he took a new tack.
I wish to bring to the attention of the House an extremely disturbing situation in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT. I refer to the tolerance, indeed promotion, of senior diplomats known to DFAT and the Australian Federal Police as pedophiles. Not only are known pedophiles tolerated by the senior management of DFAT, but they are actively promoted. The most serious case of officially tolerated pedophilia is Mr John Holloway, the former ambassador in Manila and Cambodia, who is now enjoying a $500,000 package funded by Australian taxpayers. Amongst these predators are the current Deputy Head of Mission in the Australian Embassy at Phnom Penh, the Telstra representative in Hanoi, who's a former DFAT officer and a former Australian ambassador stationed in Hanoi in the late 1980s.
Horrified is not too strong a word to describe the response of the government, but Mr Aldred ploughed on.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the pedophile network in DFAT is also facilitated by the new rule that allows same-sex partners to have all the rights and advantages of spouses. The The distortion of the strict rules on adoption has seen senior DFAT personnel adopt Asian children who are subsequently used for sexual purposes. Why do the pedophile networks and DFAT seek to represent Australia and Asia? The primary reason, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that child sex is not illegal in those countries. Young children are available and cheap. There are immense difficulties in laying charges and proving the age of victims. Pedophiles are extremely skilled in avoiding detection. One of their favourite techniques is to employ locally engaged staff of a vulnerable age, which provides them with cover for their deviant activities. They are a public health risk and a security risk. There are photographs and videos of senior Australian diplomats circulating the capital cities of some of our trading partners in the region. DFAT senior management evidently regards the activities of pedophiles as indicating a legitimate sexual preference. It's a matter of departmental and national honour.
Order. The question is that grievance has been noted. The Honourable Minister.
Mr Acting Speaker, I wonder if I could seek your indulgence to make
No, you may not, but you do, as a Minister, have the unique right to reply at the end of the grievance debate. The question is that grievance has been noted. The Honourable Member for Werriwa.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Liberal Party in this place, of course, and also in the Senate, has hit new lows in terms of its contempt of the parliamentary institution and its contempt of parliamentary privilege. But even the Liberal Party has had the sense, to disendorse the member for Deakin, and I seriously hope that's the last time we see him in this chamber, because those sorts of accusations, without presenting them to the minister, without the knowledge of the government, of course, are beneath contempt.
Gough Whitlam, as Prime Minister in 75, you were sacked amid great controversy about what these powers actually were. Surely those who've maintained their rage would want to see the fine print of any president's powers.
No, Paul, I don't. Certainly I accept the fact that the powers of the Senate to delay supply, which is what happened in 75, are unacceptable. I also accept the fact that we must have an Australian head of state. That is, if our head of state had been in Australia in 75, what happened would not have happened.
But you don't want to spell out the powers?
No, I think it's much easier to change the head of state than to change the powers of the Senate. And the two issues don't have to be linked. They shouldn't be linked. That is, if we continue to be a monarchy, we should still change the power of the Senate to delay supply. And we shouldn't delay the Republic in order so that the Senate can no longer delay the budget. That is, they're two separate issues. And the other thing which nobody's mentioned up to this stage is that the Governor of New South Wales has no reserved power in this respect because the Legislative Council was denied that power as far back as 1933. And the Governor of Victoria, the Governor of South Australia, have no such reserved power because in 84 the Legislative Councils of those states were denied the power to delay supply. And of course there's only one house in Queensland, one house in the two territories. The only parliaments in Australia where the upper house can delay supply are in Tasmania and Western Australia and in the federal parliament. And in Britain, the Westminster system, the House of Lords hasn't been able to delay supply since 1911.
Gough, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time, sir. Malcolm Turnbull, why is it so important to you that the powers are written down? We've heard such a lot against the idea.
Well, my first and most important concern was that the Constitution be made more meaningful. And I'm delighted to see that the non-contentious powers, that's to say, the fact that the head of state should act on the advice of the government of the day, the Prime Minister, other than in these special reserve areas, will be spelt out. So that's a big step forward. In other words, my concerns about this being the ultra-minimalist amendment have been misplaced. They were false fears.
But you've said if any bowling club in the country can have a constitution its members can understand and read, why not the country itself?
Well, the only thing that is stopping agreement on the reserve powers is not a legal issue. As Cheryl Saunders said quite rightly, it's a political one. The difference is that the members of the bowling club, when they get together to frame their rules, meet in a spirit of goodwill with an intention to reach agreement. Now, if we could get our political leaders to sit down in that sort of spirit of goodwill, they could frame the set of rules where the head of state could sack a prime minister, and that's only going to be very special circumstances. That could be done readily. It's a political problem, not a legal one. But you see, the option that the government's taking is essentially incorporating the existing conventions on reserve powers by reference. And that's one of the three approaches to the reserve powers that were put up by the Republic Advisory Committee. It's not the one I prefer as an ideal matter, but it's a lot better than leaving the Constitution in precisely the uninformative form it is at the moment.
Gareth Evans, you've said that it would be the labour of Hercules. It would take 30 years of patient debate.
Well, the difference from the bowling club is there's no upper chamber in the bowling club determining whether the bar bills are paid. The society we are operating is much more complex, and unfortunately we've inherited this standoff between the Senate and the House of Representatives, which does create a very special set of complications when you're working out whether the President should have the power to appoint, dismiss and refuse dissolutions to the Prime Minister of the day. You can't untangle the pure reserve power issue from the problem about the Senate, and given that, you do inherit the ghost of 75 and all the politics that go with it, and I think it really will be at least another generation before that ghost can be laid. So what you're doing is you're denying yourselves the possibility of having a head of state who's one of us for another generation if you get caught up in that conundrum.